weren't here the last few weeks, we kind of mentioned that we were going to be talking about this month something a little bit different, because normally what we'll do is maybe you would expect to have go into a passage. That's what we've been doing, right? We look at a passage and then we get deeper into the passage. Sometimes it might be something more inspirational where we're trying to be inspired to make a change, something like that. But today, for this month, we're actually doing a different approach. We're actually doing something a little bit different here. And what we're going to be doing actually can be taken from biblical passage. So if we look just briefly at Luke 1 through 4, we'll see this idea about evidence and about eyewitnesses. And it sounds a lot like a homicide case. It sounds a lot like a crime scene here in Luke 1 through 4. He says this. He says, "Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who were from the first, were eyewitnesses, and were servants of the Lord. Therefore, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, it seemed good also to me to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things that you have been taught." We mentioned a few weeks ago, last week as well, that you don't have to just check your brains at the door, is a phrase that's used. In other words, just say, well, I have this faith and there's nothing behind it. You can actually have evidence, as he's mentioning here. He had carefully investigated. He talked to eyewitnesses. And Luke was able to know with certainty the things that he had been taught. And so this month we're going to be learning how to be a detective. We're going to be looking through the eyes of a guy named J. Warner Wallace. This is the book, Cold Case Christianity, and I know one couple who is not able to be here this morning actually purchased the book. If you want the book, it's going to be about $13. It's going to get into a lot more than we're going to be able to talk about over the course of this month. But it's a great book that has a lot of information and pictures, some that we'll be using today and in the coming weeks. But J. Warner Wallace is a homicide detective. If you've ever watched Dateline, NBC, or 2020 Primetime, those shows, you've probably seen him before, not even know it, because he often comes on and talks about the cases that they're profiling there on the episodes. So we're going to look through the lens of several different ways that we can learn to be a detective, and then we're going to use those same principles and apply them to proving the Gospels, to proving especially the story of Jesus specifically. So first and foremost, we do have some slides today to look at, so I'm going to be referencing to these. So cold case homicides are events from the distant past for which there is often little to no forensic evidence. So how are these things solved? These cold case homicides, they're often solved by examining eyewitness statements, by finding out what do we have on file, comparing those eyewitness statements with the evidence that we do have. And so a lot of times, cold case homicides don't necessarily have DNA evidence intact. They may not have some of the things that we have today. And so they need to rely upon different tactics in order to solve these homicide cases. Well, in the same way, Christianity makes a claim about an event from the distant past for which there is little forensic evidence. In coming weeks, we will see some artifacts and some evidence that has actually been found historically that will be evidence, but we only have a little bit of evidence. So we need to use other tactics as a cold case homicide would use in order to solve this case of Christianity. So today we're going to look at 3 of these different principles that we can look at in order to learn to be a detective. The first principle is don't be a know-it-all. So when it comes to being a detective, you need to enter every single investigation with your eyes and your ears and all your senses wide open, with your mind wide open to all the reasonable answers. You don't just walk in with a philosophy that dictates the outcome. You can't just go in and say, well, I think this is what it is. As it goes for Detective Wallace, when he was young on the case, he had been involved in a couple different robbery cases and things like that, but when he was first put on his first homicide, he didn't want to just run in there and start making observations. So he relied upon an older detective named Alan Jeffries. And so Alan Jeffries came in. It was the middle of the night. They had been called to the scene. And, younger detective Wallace, he was there kind of seeing what Jeffries was going to do. Jeffries was very opinionated. He was right to the point. He went in there, he looked around, and he saw a few things right away. He saw there was no forced entry into the house. He saw that there was a couple in a photo on the nightstand that had been knocked onto the floor, but it looked like there was a couple. The woman that was dead was a victim there in the bedroom. And he noticed when he looked into the closet that there were some men's clothing hanging there, but it looked as if some other clothing that belonged to a man had been missing. And so right away, the seasoned detective Jeffries, he said, you know what, I'm going back to bed, find me the husband did it. It's always the husband, 99% of the time, and he just used his past and his philosophy, it dictated the outcome into the case. So of course they went out, they interviewed the husband and all these things, and it was only 3 months later that they discovered who it was. It was actually the next door neighbor that committed the homicide, and the woman actually turned out to be single. The man in the photo was actually the woman's brother, and he often visited from overseas, and he would keep some of his clothing at her house. And so, at the very beginning, if they hadn't even looked past that initial first little thought, they would have just arrested the husband. And of course, it's great that we have the other evidence and the other details to be able to look into instead of just relying upon that thought. But Jeffries, he had many years in it, so he was kind of the know-it-all in the case, right? So, in the same way, we transition over to looking at the Gospels, and we think about approaching the idea of believing in Jesus, and believing of if his resurrection was actually true, for example. There's a thought out there, there's a belief out there called philosophical naturalism. It's a big word, but a lot of people believe in it. It's essentially the belief that rejects the existence of anything supernatural. So if your explanation involves any sort of supernatural reasoning, they just say, well, that's impossible. I don't want to accept that. I don't believe it. I don't think it's even possible. So I'm not going even to examine that evidence. It's the kind of person who says, hey, everything that we see around us, all creation, us as humans, anything that we see it can be explained by natural laws or natural forces. If we can't explain it, it's just because science hasn't figured it out yet. But there's a scientific explanation for everything in the world. That's what philosophical naturalism says. And so when it comes to examining the Gospels, when it comes to examining the story of Jesus and the claims of the Gospels, we need to realize that we need to go where the evidence leads. The next slide here. We need to go where the evidence leads, not where the presuppositions lead. And I know if you're sitting way back there, you may not be able to see. So I'll tell you a little bit about what this says here. Our presuppositions for jurors, if you're on a case and you're in a jury, a dangerous presupposition would be people with beady eyes are suspicious. If you have that and there's a guy in there with beady eyes, oh yeah, he just looks guilty, right? Well, that's dangerous presupposition. People of my race would never commit a crime like this. Well, we don't know that. We need to look at the evidence, right? Police officers are liars and untrustworthy. If you're in a jury and you have that presupposition, next thing you know, a police officer comes to the witness stand and you're saying, well, I don't believe a thing he's saying, right? And so you might set a killer free because you're not believing the eyewitness testimony of a police officer. So those are dangerous presuppositions for jurors in a homicide case. But if we're talking about truth seekers, if we're looking for the truth, dangerous presuppositions would be something like, there's nothing that exists out of the natural realm. If it can't be tested with my five senses, it just doesn't exist. That's impossible. Or thirdly, supernatural explanations must be eliminated. So when we go into this, the first principle we have to realize is don't be a know-it-all. Don't just think, well, anything supernatural, that's got to be eliminated right off the bat. We need to realize we need to go where the evidence leads, not where our presuppositions lead. So if we examine the evidence of Jesus and it turns out to be fake, okay, that's where the evidence led. But we don't start by saying, well, there's no way a person could rise from the dead, so obviously that's thrown out the window. We need to examine all the evidence and then find out where it leads. Second principle that we're going to look at today. Learn how to infer. Okay, so we need to realize that there's a difference between possible and reasonable. So anything is possible. Technically, if we think about it, anything is possible, but not everything is reasonable. So it's possible right now that none of us are actually here in this church, that we've all been abducted by aliens that kind of plugged into our minds and are just making us think we're here today, right? It's possible, I suppose, but it's not very reasonable. It's not logical. It doesn't, when we examine the evidence, that doesn't seem to make much sense. So let's take a look at our crime scene here. So we come across the crime scene, and we're going to come into some different parts of this crime scene. So first we look into the room, and we see a dead man, and he's lying face down. Okay? So there are 4 possibilities right now that we see. It could have been a natural death, could have been an accidental death somehow, it could have been a suicide, or it could have been a homicide. Now, as we look at this, we have yet to be able to do DNA evidence, fingerprinting, all of that. We're just inferring from the crime scene what our possibilities are and what is reasonable. So let's add something else to our crime scene. We now see the dead man laying face down, but he's lying in a pool of blood that seems to be coming from his abdomen. Okay, so it's possible that some natural death caused him to bleed. But is it very reasonable? Is it logical to think that somehow he had a pool of blood coming out of him? No, it's not. It's still reasonable to assume that it could have been an accident somehow, that it could have been a suicide or a homicide. But at this point, we can safely say it's not reasonable to infer a natural death. Let's add something else. Now we see he has a knife in his back. Okay, so an accident to think that he was cutting the onions and he slipped and fell on his back, and it doesn't seem very logical, very reasonable. Possible, but the odds are so great that we could probably rule out an accidental death. So we're looking at a suicide or a homicide, and suicide is not very believable even with that. But if we were to examine the body and we find multiple stab wounds, we now see that all of those things are still within the realm of possibility. It's very unreasonable that someone's going to stab themselves in the back multiple times, and so a homicide would be the route that we would go. And we do all of that just by inferring the situation. We look at it and we infer. We haven't had any DNA evidence yet. We haven't looked at any of the other details about the crime scene or the fingerprinting. But what we've done now is we've just looked and said, okay, this is what we can infer about it, just using our logic, using our reason. So, in the same way, now let's apply that to the Gospels. There are 4 facts that most scholars accept about the life of Jesus. We can put that up. So these are things that when we look over this list, we realize there's nothing supernatural about this list. There's just the claims, and these are historically accurate facts that non-Christians and Christians alike would agree on, most scholars would agree on upon the life of Jesus. Firstly, Jesus died and he was buried. Secondly, the tomb was empty and no one ever found a body. That is historically backed up by other documents, which we'll get into in following weeks, but it was actually empty. There was no body ever produced. Thirdly, the disciples believed, now were they right or wrong, that's yet to be seen, but they believed they saw Jesus resurrected. And then fourthly, the disciples were transformed following their observations. So after they saw what they believed to be Jesus resurrected, they were then transformed. There was a difference in their actions before and after that time. These are these four facts that we know from Christian and non-Christian sources alike. And again, this doesn't prove anything about the truth of the resurrection. It just tells us, hey, some guys believed something, there was no body. Now, what's the truth of it? So we have to look at, just as we just did with our crime scene, we have our list of possibilities now. How do we explain these 4 facts? Well, in the book there's a bunch of different possibilities explored, but we're only going to look at a few of them today. The first being the possibility that the disciples were wrong. Is it possible that the disciples were wrong about Jesus' dying, and he actually survived the resurrection? Maybe Jesus faked his death. You know, he was up there on the cross. That's for sure. He was there on the cross. We have those records. We know that he was crucified. But maybe it's possible that Jesus pretended to die so that then he would be put in the tomb, and then he could sneak out on his own and tell everybody, look, I'm back from the dead. Everybody believed it. Everybody was transformed because of that crazy trick that Jesus did, but it was all fake. Well, that's a possibility. Let's look at the problems with that. Well, if we believe that the disciples were wrong, first of all, first century non-Christian sources historically look at, they confirm his death. So there's a death record from non-Christian sources apart from the Bible that say that Jesus died and was buried. Now again, we say, well, maybe they were tricked. Maybe they thought he died, but he didn't really die. Well, the guards who were there, stationed at the tomb, and those who were also there to check out the resurrection, to check out the crucifixion, they're stationed at the crucifixion, they would have faced death if they allowed a prisoner to survive crucifixion. So we would have to be dealing with the sloppiest, worst, buffoons of all the Roman Empire in charge of Jesus' crucifixion. They would have had to somehow overlooked everything. But they themselves, if they allowed Jesus to survive, they would have been killed themselves. So to think that Jesus somehow tricked everyone, including these guards that had killed thousands of people, they were so used to this, is very unreasonable. Is it possible? Okay, but it's not reasonable. It's not logical. And then thirdly, the problem with that is that Jesus would have had to control his blood loss. Somehow up there on the cross, that image of Jesus, he's pinned to a cross. He has no way to control his own blood loss, especially at the end of the crucifixion. When they tested to see if he was dead, they put a spear in his side. So now he's supposedly going around with a spear in his side, bleeding out there, and he's somehow tricking everybody, able to survive. It just doesn't make sense. So it doesn't seem logical or reasonable to think that the disciples were wrong and that Jesus made the whole thing up. Now, secondly, we could assume maybe it's possible that the disciples lied themselves. That Jesus really died, that he was buried, and they just lied and made up the whole story. They made up the whole thing, the 12 of them. Now, we will get into a lot more about the disciples' eyewitness testimony, because that's a big part of the case. We'll get into that as the weeks go on, even more a little bit here today. But first of all, the disciples lacked a motive. They did not have a motive to lie about this, because they could have been in prison. They could have been killed, stoned, flogged, all these types of things, tortured. They had no motive besides maybe their own embarrassment in following somebody who would die. But I think it outweighs the other issues that they could have faced. Secondly, if the disciples had lied, the locals in the area would have been able to call that out. Now, thousands of years later, when we read these stories, we weren't present there. To be able to look at this and say, well, I know because I was there and I could see that he wasn't walking around. But the locals, when this first came out, when they were writing these stories, they were still alive during the time of Jesus. They were still alive when he was supposedly resurrected. So there should have been many accounts of people saying, hey, I know this is fake, this is a lie, and here's why. I just went down to the grave and there was Jesus. He was still buried. The tomb's still there. They would have had to have fooled all the locals, which we don't have any account of that historically. We don't have any thing to say that. Thirdly, the problem with this idea, and the disciples lied, is that the Romans were guarding the tomb. We already said this a little bit, talked about the Romans. But to think that somehow, maybe the disciples stole the body. That's a big idea that's been going around since the time of the Gospels. It actually is mentioned here that in one of the Gospels that the officials said, well, let's just tell them that the disciples stole the body. That's been going around from back then until now. And yet, again, it doesn't make sense. How are two Roman soldiers, or however many they had there, they had these Roman soldiers stationed, how are they going to be overpowered by the disciples? How are they going to be, falling asleep at the job, knowing they'd be risking their lives on such a high-profile case? All these types of things just don't seem to add up to think that it would be reasonable that the disciples would have lied. Thirdly, the third one we're going to look at, the disciples, were they delusional? They really believed what they were thinking. Maybe they experienced hallucinations that made them think that Jesus was really there. And so they wrote these things thinking it was 100% true, but it really wasn't. Well, the problems with that, if anybody knows anything about hallucinations or delusions, is that we know that these things happen, but to have 12 people, and they all agree on this, and they're having the same hallucination, it's long, it's sustained, it's a group thing, and it's over the course of many years, they're still believing in this same thing, and it's the same story. It doesn't seem reasonable. We know that individuals could have delusions, but they're usually short term. It's not going to continue on. And it's not going to be this whole group together in the same kind of manner. And further than that, we know of certain groups who have been delusioned, like cults or those types of things. But they were always in on it, right? The cult members, they're always wanting to be deeper into the cult. But people like, an example of Thomas, one of the disciples, he was not in on it because he was not favorable to hallucinations. He didn't want to believe the stories of Jesus until he saw it for himself. He saw the evidence. So it's not as if all the disciples were like, oh, we really want to believe he's still alive, so let's take this mushroom or something. It doesn't make sense because Thomas was even kind of against the idea until he saw it for himself. So fourthly and finally for today, as far as this goes, we've seen that we can cross off on the list that they were wrong, they were lying, they were delusional. If we had time, we would see that they weren't fooled, they weren't influenced, they weren't distorted. But these four facts on our left, Jesus died and was buried, his tomb was empty. The disciples claimed to see Jesus resurrected, and his disciples were transformed from just inferring, not looking at all the deep evidence yet, but just inferring what we can about that situation. We have to assume that the only thing on the list is that they were accurate. Now, of course, there's a problem with believing that the disciples' testimony, that their eyewitness testimony was accurate. The problem is that it requires a belief in the supernatural. So it goes back to our very first thing of not being a know-it-all, of saying, hey, I'm going to rule that one out because no one comes back from the dead, so let's just rule it completely out. That's the only problem that we have with that possibility on our list. The other things have so many problems with them that they can be ruled out pretty simply. Now, of course, that's just the surface level. We're inferring, we're looking at it and just saying, here's what we can, just surface level, infer about this situation. But we have to also apply the evidence and the eyewitness testimony, which we will do in some other weeks. So let's look at our final thing for today as far as principle for today. Resist conspiracy theories. And this goes into a little bit of what we've already been talking about with the disciples. But we'll get even deeper into it now. And this is the idea with the conspiracy, as it pertains to the Gospels. It's this conspiracy that the 12 disciples carried out the most elaborate and influential conspiracy of all time, which is what it would have to be. 2,000 years later, people are still believing fully in this thing. It was very elaborate. They would have had to have all sorts of people on different levels involved in the conspiracy. And as far as conspiracies go,